way I can say what I want to say to you guys. And you're the priest of your house, of your home. And I believe that there are in certain situations that God requires us to be the priesthood of the home. And that don't mean that we're the ultimate boss and we beat everybody in the family down, but we stand in the gap and make up a hedge sometimes for what happens in our life, in our family's life. Got a very interesting thought this morning, and I'll be reading from 2 Corinthians, the first chapter, and we'll start in the third verse and the fourth verse. And I'll read it, but I want you to think about there's a lot being said in this verse. The two verses actually, third verse and fourth verse. And it talks about Paul saying something to us. Of course, he was writing a letter to the Corinthian church. But he said something very important to them. And as Christians, I believe it's our charge to carry the gospel in a very unique way. You may never stand before a group of people and preach. You may never lead a song. You may never stand on a stage and talk to you like I'm talking to you now, talk to people like I'm speaking to you. But God's got something for each of us, and it's very special, and it's something only you can do. And let me read this before I get too far ahead, but let's pray first. Lord, I ask you to anoint this word this morning. Help me to deliver it like you gave it to me. Thank you, Lord, for your precious word in Jesus' name. We find in the third verse it says, "Blessed be God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort." Now, if you've been saved any length of time, you'll know that God is the Father of all mercies. And He's the Father, and He is the giver of comfort. If you were broken and under conviction like I was before you accepted Him, before you went to pray and you really got down to business praying, you know what I'm talking about, how comforting that felt when the burden of sin was lifted off of you. And I could distinctly remember that night. I can deny a lot of things in this world and in my life. I can tell you I did this or I did that. But I can tell you one thing for sure, and I'll never be able to deny this, that God was working on me that night. I was under conviction, and I was the first one at the altar, and I went before the altar call. I went during a song. And early on in the service, I didn't listen to 30, 40 minutes of preaching. I didn't have anybody give me a sad story. But I knew that God was working on me when I walked in the building. But it had happened a long time before that, down through the years. There would be times when God was calling me. And finally, I quit denying that and accepted Him. And I found out what comfort really was, how God can comfort someone. The fourth verse says, He's talking about God who comforteth us in all of our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble by the comfort wherewith we ourselves were comforted of God. So He comforts us and shows us what God's real hand of comfort is, and then the reason I'm doing this for you is so you will know how to comfort others. That's why the church is so important in our land today. You know, when He saves you and you become a Christian, you don't realize it at the time, but He's changed your heart. All of a sudden, the people you hate, you don't hate them anymore. At least you'll learn to not hate them, because you'll never be complete in your comfort and love toward other people when you hate people. Hatred don't belong in your heart. Aren't you glad for that? I know we got veterans here today, but you know, a man that's been in combat, And I can't relate to that because I've never been there. But I've heard testimonies of Christians, men that became Christians after they had been in combat. They finally got to a point in their life where they could deal with that situation. God was a comforting God. And they learned what that was. Being able to comfort. But let's talk about trouble for a moment. And tribulation. We all deal with that in certain degrees. There's a lot of tribulations. And there's a lot of discomfort. Even if you're a Christian, you can be the most perfect man. You can be the most perfect before God. But you're going to incur trouble. Trouble's going to come your way. That's where the devil comes in. That's his job, to create trouble for us, and he does a pretty good job, I'd say. If there's anything he does good, he walks to and fro in this land, and he finds somebody to cause trouble with. Now, that's all I'm going to give him credit for. But there's a unique story in the Bible, and you all know about it, and it's in the book of Job. And let's read in the first chapter of Job as we get going, but I'm going to talk about some wounds, and I'm going to talk about some of them that glow in the dark a little bit later. Get you thinking about that for a minute. I don't know if you've ever heard that terminology, but the first chapter of Job. In the first chapter, it tells about Job. It says a few personal things about him. It said there's a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was a perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil, or he avoided evil. And that, there's not too many things said about people like that. You don't find too many people like that. Now, we're all on different, I'm human, and I tell you right now, I'm not a perfect man. I never have been. I wish I could be, but hopefully we'll get better as we go along. But Job was a perfect man. Now, keep this in mind. He avoided evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And y'all probably know this more than I do. His substance was also 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household. So this man was the greatest of all men of the East, the most wealthy, the most respected, the most well-known. God had blessed him. And it was so. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his certain day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. And listen to this. For Job said, I'm going to paraphrase here just a little bit, but Job said, just perhaps, just in case, maybe some of my kids have transgressed God some way or another, I want to offer this offering. And this is where the priesthood of Job came to be. He was looking over his family and being a guardian over his family, so to speak, by giving a sacrifice to God, even though he didn't know about any sin. Perhaps they had sinned. Maybe they haven't. Maybe they had. But he said, I'm not going to take any chances. I'm going to cover this base. Wouldn't we be better off if we just covered all these bases sometimes in life? Wouldn't it be better off if we prayed about a business venture? If we prayed about this or we prayed about that and said, Lord, I need a new truck. show me one that don't burn too much oil. I just want to get in my budget here. Show me the right one. It don't have to be the color you're fond of, but Lord, show me the one I need. Show me that in life, everything that I do. But tribulation is going to come his way, and it does. Now, there was a great meeting, and I can't explain all this, but I can read it, and you can make your own opinion about it. And there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Don't you know no matter where God's people go, Satan's always going to come among them. He's going to try something. He's always going to be around. So that's why we need to be in tune. And the Lord said unto Satan, Where have you been, or whence comest thou? He said, Oh, I've been down on the earth. I've been walking to and fro, up and down in the earth. And God said something. He said, Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Now, remember, Job didn't know anything about what was fixing to happen. Job had no reason. He's been blessed of God. He's completely ignorant to the fact that God's going to let Satan wreck his whole life and his whole world. It would have been a good time for him to say, why? Let's go a little bit further. He said, There's none like him on the earth, or in the earth. He's perfect and upright man, one that fears God and avoids evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Does Job fear God for naught? Or why does he fear you? He said, Look, you've made a hedge about him and around his house and about all that he hath on every side. You've blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. The reason he loves you is because you've blessed him so much. You've surrounded him with material things, and that's why he loves you. That's why he honors you. He said, You just let me take that away, and he'll curse you to your face. And I guess God was putting the devil to the test at this time. And the Lord said, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth your hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job. And I'm not going to read all of that, but here comes a messenger and says, The house is fallen on all your children. A great wind come up. It's killed all of your children. Your 7 sons are dead. Your 3 beautiful daughters are dead. It comes on up. Another messenger comes up, even while that was being said. Another messenger comes up, and all of your servants are gone. You see, a man that's in that time, he probably had a lot of servants out. He had businesses. He had a lot of things going on. He had multitudes of people that he was responsible for, but they were like his household. And then come to find out, all of his oxen are gone, all of his camels, all of his donkeys, and everything that was valued to him. And in that culture at that time, it was material possessions, flocks of camels and oxen. All of that was gone, taken away. Wonder what he was thinking. I wonder what Job was thinking. What would you think? I've seen a lot of bad things happen to a lot of good people, and I know you have. It's hard not to question why. But all of us have seen times when things don't go right, when things seem like they go off the rail. You know, they say that a lot of businessmen, successful businessmen, have gone bankrupt 2 or 3 times. How could anybody go bankrupt and turn right around and get a mental fortitude enough to start another venture in another business? I'm going to tell you something. I've been in a financial struggle a time or two, and the first thing I ever thought, I'll never borrow another dollar. Of course, in most business ventures, you have to get started a lot of times, but you know, that would discourage a lot of people. It would discourage me. But some people can rise above that. We're writing a story. Our life story, we're writing it now. But don't write the final chapter just yet. Well, after all of that, there comes another assault. The next time, it was a physical assault upon his body. The second chapter there, we won't read all of it, but it talks about Job being, he said, Satan says, skin for skin. I take a pound of flesh from him. He'll curse you then. Well, the Lord allowed that to happen. He had boils all over his body. He was sitting with a piece of broken pottery, scraping the sores and the dust and ashes. And well, as word gets around that Job's having a hard time, well, first thing you know, here comes some friends. Now, how important is it to have good friends come around when you're down and out? I've had a few friends come comfort me. Now, for 7 days and 7 nights, his 3 friends sit there with him and commiserate with him in an effort to, but nobody says a word for 7 days and 7 nights. Now, I can't understand that, but sometimes you got to be careful who you pick for friends when you're in a dire strait. If you're got a bad diagnosis on your health, don't call one of your friends that don't believe in healing, that don't believe that God can do something for you. Don't call somebody to come and help you. It'd be like me. Somebody called me and said, I'm going to have a brain surgery scheduled for Monday, and I want you to be in the operating room, and I want you to do some of the procedure. Well, that'd be ridiculous, because I don't know anything about that. Nothing I know about that. So it'd be ridiculous to call me into your operating room. But as a friend, you got confidence in your friends. But sometimes that you need to put your confidence into God first. But people mean well. But nobody can comfort another person like somebody that's been there. And we've all been to the funeral home. And we're called to be comforters to our brother and our sisters and the community we live in. We're called to be comforters to them and help them in times of trouble. Sometimes we don't have words, and I've struggled to have words. Have you ever been to the bedside of someone that looks like they maybe have 2 or 3 days left, or just moments and just barely coherent? What a struggle it is to find words for those people. I'm very uncomfortable in that situation. I've been there a few times. I can barely get out, and I love you, brother, or we're praying for you, or whatever. I've been to the funeral home, and a baby's laying there in that casket. I can't relate to that, but I feel something heavy. It's a heaviness there. I'm struggling for words. You know, you put your arm around somebody, and sometimes words are not adequate. You know what I mean? And as men, we always try to hide our emotions, but sometimes there's a knot in my throat, and I just can't hardly get a word out. But sometimes that's probably okay, because a handshake or put your arm around somebody when There's something special about that. It's a human touch. That's something that you don't find in the doctor's office most of the time. It's a structured. But as Christians, we have something special to share, and it's comfort, it's mercy, and it's real. Job was looking for that in his friends. He was looking for that. He didn't know what was going on in the heavenlies. He just knew that everything in his world was crashing down upon him. Can you imagine losing all of your children at one time? Can you imagine losing all the possessions you have? And truly he honored God, and God said himself he was perfect and upright. So, we go a little bit further. I suppose that Job was wounded. I would think that he was wounded. Well, let me tell you another little story. You might have learned something about it, heard about it before, but there was a phenomenon in the Civil War time that wounds that would glow in the dark. And it's documented that at the Battle of Shiloh, which occurred in April the 6th and the 7th of 1862, I believe it is, that they were on the battlefield in Shiloh. Now, during the Civil War, there's 620,000 soldiers died. That can be debated a little bit one way or the other, but different sources that you search around, there's well over 600,000 people died. And at Shiloh that first day, now there was 3 or 4 different battles. They were kind of an ebb and flow situation in different areas right along in there in that Shiloh battlefield. But there was 23,000 plus soldiers killed that day. 23,000. There's very few doctors, very limited medical supplies, medical technology was limited. All of the soldiers, the dead were laying everywhere, the wounded were laying everywhere. They were makeshift clinics, or just, there might have been 10 doctors there during that day, but they were overwhelmed, of course. But the bacteria, the conditions on the battlefield, it was raining and muddy. The soldiers, very little hygiene. They'd been out in the camps for weeks and months and traveling, and it was just a horrible situation. They amputated a lot of people's legs and arms, and that saved their life sometimes. But there was something unique about that night after all of that carnage, that how the bacteria and infection started on those bodies. And some of the soldiers that had the most glow on them were the ones that survived. And that's how they turned the term angel glow. And you can read up on this and search it out, but it was discovered by 2 high school students, actually. And one of them's mother was a biochemist that talked about bacteria and things that you see under the microscope that you don't see with the naked eye or anything, but sometimes it would involve insects that would light on your arm. You know how you can set a bucket of something out there somewhere, like you clean fish, and put that bucket out there? Well, if you don't come back to it, and within a few days, you come back and it's going to be full of maggots. And that's not a bad thing sometimes, because some of those insects and those critters that crawl around on your skin produce a bacteria that aids in healing, actually, because they're feeding on the dead skin particles, and that cleans that out. And I can't describe all that, but it's kind of gory. But this battlefield situation, it's a sad situation to look at. And that's actually documented how that happened. But it took 149 years for them to decide that's what that was. And they called it an angel glow, because sometimes it caused them to live. Well, Job was, he was wounded for sure. And we have wounds and we have scars. All of us have wounds. There's been things that hurt us in the past. And a scar is a sign of a healing. When you have a scar, it means, I got a big old, and you can barely see it now, but it's a big old long scratch. And it festered up, and it had a scab on it. Well, that was all of that process of healing. It didn't happen instantly, but over several weeks there, that thing healed right up. And now it'll probably go away completely. But I have another one right here that will always be with me until I'm buried. And I remember the day that I crawled out a window. I was doing a roof. It was on Benny Pace's house when he built it 20 plus years, 30 years ago probably. I had a razor knife in my back pocket. And I climbed out an upstairs window and we were roofing out there. And when I turned around, I felt a burning sensation on my arm, and then the blood was everywhere. It was dripping. And I had sliced my arm off open with a razor knife. Had a new blade in it. Don't you know that feels good? And it cut so easy and so deep. But I'll always have that scar there, but that scar is just a reminder of a healing. There's a lot of emotional things that we go through as Christians and disappointments that causes us to have scars and wounds. And some of them will glow. I got a good outlook right here. I smile about this scar, but I wasn't smiling the day that happened. So I didn't write my story about that bad incident right then. I wrote it after it was over. Why? Why did that happen? Well, it could have been my fault. It could have been the razor knife's fault. It could have been the window's fault. I'm not asking why. In life, we go through a lot of things, and we can ask why all day long. Why is your family member sick right now? You could spend all of your time asking God why. I can ask God why did Kenneth Burkhead get in an accident yesterday farming? He's got busted up pretty bad in an accident, moving hay rolls or something. But you can spend all day long about why things happen. And it's personally, we're writing a story, but when are you going to write the book? When are you going to finish the book? During the why or after it's over? Don't write your book in the why. Don't make decisions in the why. We can always ask that. It says in 2 Corinthians verse 3 and 4, we're talking about the first chapter there, the scripture that we read, that we are to comfort because we've been comforted. And I like that. I got to remember that I was comforted. That's why I want to comfort someone else. Now, let's see. Job had some very interesting statements. One of them, he said, the Lord gives and the Lord is taken. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And that was the end of that story. It was the end of that line of thought. He was able to, in the worst time of his life, say, I'm okay with it. I don't like what happened, but I'm not going to question God about everything. And you know, sometimes we have to forgive God. That sounds crazy, don't it? But we blame Him for things that happened. And we're bitter toward God for things that happened. Especially when we know it wasn't our fault. How could God let this happen to me? He knows I was right and those other people were wrong. He knows they hurt me. They said awful things about me. How does God let that happen? Remember when Jesus was on the cross, I'm going to give you one example. Now we can live our life questioning God about why bad things happen to good people, and this is good for us to know. There were 7 things that Jesus said from the cross. One of those was, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He was asking God, why? How many times have we asked God why? When your best friend dies, when your child dies. We all have that human side of us that we want to know why. I didn't deserve that. Why? Why does that happen? Jesus was on a mission, an eternal purpose, when he was on the cross. He didn't mince words. He didn't waste a sentence or word. After he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Immediately, he went from that human side of him, which he became sin for us. At that point, he was hurting just like we would hurt. He turned right around and went from that and said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. That tells me that there's a lesson to be learned, and whenever there's a why in our life, that we should forgive. Because if you hurt me, it's going to take me a while probably to forgive you. Oh, I can say I forgive you. But forgiving somebody and saying you forgive them is 2 different things. If you hurt me bad enough, it may take me a while to forgive you. I may say, oh, I forgive you. It's okay. Don't worry about it. But then I think about it the next day, or I think about it the next week, or I dwell on it. Nobody knows you're thinking about that except you, but I haven't really forgiven yet. Jesus was able to go from the, why have you forsaken me, to turn right around and give forgiveness. He knew how to comfort, didn't he? Job's wife told him to give up, go ahead and curse God and die. And for 30 chapters, almost the rest of the whole book of Job goes through there. It's bombarded with bad news, bad advice. For 30 chapters it talks about it. There was a famous author in France, I think his name was, I read this the other day, Hugo, I think it's Hugo. He wrote a lot of famous books, and he had a treasure trove of books in his home and library, and he was a great writer and world renowned. And the story goes they almost named Paris Hugo. They really talked about it instead of Paris, France. They talked about naming it after him. But somebody asked him, said, if you could go back and pick out a book of all of the great books that you've read and the ones you've written, what book would it be? And he said, it would be the book of Job. And they looked puzzled. They said, they wondered why he wouldn't pick out a book that he wrote or one of the famous books at the time. He says, because every man will find himself at some point or at some degree in the book of Job. But the important thing to remember is we're not writing our story in the middle of the story. Job didn't write the story while all this was going on. From what I can find, the book of Job was written by different people, perhaps. And they don't think Job actually wrote the book. They said maybe Moses. I've seen several different opinions. But the thing about it is, Job waited a few years after all this calamity in his life to write the book. Now, I know famous people that their book ended on a bad note. They ended in defeat. I know Christians that have had something bad happen to them and they give up. The final chapter is they walked away from God. They wrote their story. That's not the way it ought to be. But if you go to the 42nd chapter of Job, I think it is around the 42nd chapter, it gives a rendition. I think it is the last chapter. It's called The Deliverance of Job and His Friends. But it says in the 10th, I won't read all of it, but it says in the 10th verse, the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. When he forgave his friends. When he forgave the people all around him that had given him bad advice. When he prayed for his friends, also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. How many times have we given up on something that God told us to do because we got into a struggle and we walked away from it and we wrote our book, we closed our book, final chapter, that didn't work out. I've done that. I've given up on a few projects that I should have stayed with for whatever reason. But Job said, I'm not going to live in the why. I'm going to release forgiveness. I'm not going to die in my why. And Job said, though he slay me, he may slay me, I'm not going to forsake him. Could we do that today? Whew. Job lived 140 years. It says in the last verse there, almost the last verse, it says, after this lived Job 140 years and saw his sons' sons, even to 4 generations. Now, things happen for a reason. And we all say, nothing happens that God don't know about, and God has a purpose in everything that happens. We will never understand some of the things that we go through in life, especially those uncomfortable things. But we're learning how to comfort others when we go through things. I think sometimes the sole purpose of our struggles down here, the reason God don't intervene quicker sometimes, is to teach us how to go through things and come out on the other side and not question God and not hate everybody because it happened, to being able to forgive each other and show other people how to, I'm going to comfort you because I know how I was comforted. How many times do you think in 140 years that Job had an opportunity to tell his story? 140 years. They said he probably lived to be over 200. There should have been more written about him, I think. What we have is a rendition of some bad times in Job's life. But God had a purpose. And Job never knew that God was allowing that to happen just to test him. God didn't tell Job he's going to do that to him. It just happened. He didn't ask God why. He didn't get bitter toward God. He just stayed true. 620,000 men died at the Civil War battles, and 2/3 of them died from disease. I can't imagine. They say there's mass graves at Shiloh. Some of them have been discovered, and some of them are not located. They don't know how many's there actually. another little piece. This, I don't know if this has anything to do with the lesson or not, but I thought it was pretty interesting that the embalming process, a lot of the Union soldiers were embalmed and sent back home for burial because that technique and that was discovered and invented in the North, and they had the chemicals already prepared to do the embalming during the Civil War. The North was practicing that, and in the South we didn't have that technology at the time. So most of our mass graves were Confederate soldiers down there in those mass graves, but nobody knows exactly how many and where they are, but there's some that's located. If you ever get a chance to go down there, I think it's a very interesting story and a place to visit. But there was a bloody pond, and there was the peach orchard, the church house. There was several different battles. It was kind of an ebb and flow situation. They would take a little ground one day, and then they'd back up the next day, and it was all over that area there. But it's very interesting. But that glow in the dark thing, they called it an angel glow. And sometimes our wounds have to go through the process of healing. It don't happen overnight sometimes. But the scars we bear can be a reminder of a healing. And that's what I'd like to look at them. The things that I've gone through in life, which not anything like what Job went through, but those things that I've gone through have helped me to comfort other people. I know what it's like to lose people that you love, and that's why I go to the funeral home, and I hope it's a genuine gesture, or I visit someone, or I care about someone. I hope that's a genuine thing that I'm presenting a comfort to other people that need comforting. So I guess that's all I want to say this morning. I hope that something I've said has triggered a thought in your mind. And as we write our life story, don't finish your final chapter in the middle of a why, because we don't have that. We'll never find out why things happen. God's not going to tell you why all the time. So just trust Him. And the final chapter, when you get out of that bad place and you look back, He delivered me. That's what I used to be. That's part of your story. So I thank you for listening to me this morning. I don't know how much time I've taken, but I feel like I'm done with what I wanted to say. So